Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see so many members of our contributors circle here, and we are always delighted to work with our good friends at SMU, and particularly with the Tower Center. I want to thank Jim Hollyfield and Josh Rovner for their support of tonight's program. And, it was, I guess, several months ago that I had the opportunity to read the review of Knife Fights. And we'd had the pleasure of having John Nagal speak for us probably about 2 or 3 years ago. And so when I saw that he had this book, I sent several emails to him, and they were not replied to. And I thought we had a nice dinner together. And then I realized that he had moved to a very interesting position as a headmaster at Haverford Prep School. So I wrote him, and within about 3 or 4 minutes, he said, "Yes, indeed, I'd like to come back to Dallas to speak." Want to thank John and Helen Stetler for sponsoring tonight's program. Both Stetlers have been very committed supporters of our work at the World Affairs Council, particularly in the area of programs that involved human rights and education in Afghanistan, where they have made very generous commitments and have a very special place in their heart for the children and women of Afghanistan. Just very quickly want to remind our members that we have David Brooks coming on May 11th, and Mr. Brooks will be speaking in Fort Worth at the Fort Worth Club at lunch, and also using our new partnership with Parish Episcopal School. He will be there the evening of May 11th, talking about his new book, The Road to Character, The Humble Journey to an Excellent Life. For those of you who subscribe to the New York Times, and I know that there are many in this room, you've been following his essays and op-ed pieces as he's been shamelessly selling his book through his op-ed sections. Also want to remind you, on May 13th, we have author Lisa Shannon at the Crescent Club, who's done an enormous amount of work in the Congo. Those of you who aren't members of the council, and those of you who aren't members of the Tower Center, you need to be sure that you're members of both organizations, and don't just trust what you get in the mail from either one of us. You got to read the emails, Mel. Today we had Governor Perry, and Mel looks at me like, I didn't know about that. Our brochures for both organizations are dated the day they are written, probably. So do go to our respective websites to learn about what we're both up to. And now, let's see, we don't want to hear any cell phones go off. If they go off, you are kindly asked to give $50 to the World Affairs Council to support a student coming to a program at the Tower Center. We'll do it that way. So pull out that AT&T cell phone and remember to turn it on after tonight's program. And now, Josh, come on up and introduce John. Oops.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. Welcome to this joint program with the World Affairs Council and the Tower Center here at SMU. It's wonderful to partner with you again. The World Affairs Council does just such terrific work, and their program is fabulous. We're also coming to the end of our academic year's programming calendar. It's been a busy, busy year at the Tower Center, as I'm sure many of you are aware. I think we're up to about our 40th event. And we've got one more next week before we let the students go away for the summer. We have an event next week on paranoia in American politics, so keep your eyes open for that. Keep your eyes wide open for that. Thank you to our forum members, and just to echo Jim's comment, if you're not a member of the forum, you should be, so give us a shout. John Nagal is here to talk about his memoir, Knife Fights, a memoir of modern war in theory and practice. There have been no shortage of knife fights over the last 20 years, both the actual wars abroad as well as the very serious fights in Washington, D.C. The fight about whether or not the United States should get involved in foreign civil wars, and if so, how. The fight about the best way to deal with insurgencies like the one we've been dealing with in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the future of the American armed forces, the future of the Army, whether or not the Army will think of its own future as preparing for these kinds of wars, or whether it will revert to its traditional conception of how to fight, that is, massed engagements against enemy conventional armies. Our speaker tonight, John Nagal, has been intimately involved in all of these debates, both in government circles, in the Army, and in the public arena. And I should say, these debates are far from being resolved. Right? These are not settled questions. Right? So it's really important to have this discussion ongoing because they're big, important questions, and we're far from resolution. John is here to talk about his own experiences, and I hope to prompt that broader conversation about the U.S. experience in contemporary wars and in future conflict. I won't read John's whole bio. You should have it by now, but I'll give you a few highlights. He is currently the 9th headmaster of the Haverford School. Prior to that, he was the president of the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C., as well as the Minerva Research Professor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. An armor officer for 20 years in the U.S. Army. He's a graduate of West Point, and he did his graduate work at Oxford University. With that, please join me in welcoming John Nagal.
Josh, thanks for that kind introduction. Jim, thanks for navigating the email thicket. I just can't keep a job, and I am really hopeful that I'm going to be able to keep this one. I'm having a remarkable amount of fun. I was reading David Brooks' book, The Road to Character, on the airplane in. I think it was the Washington Post reviewer. I don't think the New York Times reviewer would have been this honest about one of their own writers, but the Washington Post, I believe it was, said that Brooks is better in short form than in long form, and honestly, it's true.
His speech will be short,
but the speech will be short, and the conversation really matters, and so this discussion, this is very much the business I'm in now, trying to prepare young men for lives of meaning and as men of good character. And so please do, if you possibly have the chance, pick up David's book, even if the op-eds are better, and listen to him talk. He's an enormously thoughtful man, and I am no David Brooks, but I'll do the best I can. So I'm very, very pleased to be back at the Tower Center, to be back in Dallas. It's a little bit of it's literally a family reunion for me. My sister Sarah works here at SMU. I also have one of my West Point classmates here with us, and a battle buddy from my second Iraq war here as well. So I've got fact checkers here for pretty much everything I say. If any of them say, if someone suddenly shouts out, "That's not true," don't pay any attention to them. They have no idea what they're talking about. I'm going to start not with my second war, not with the war that John McLaughlin and I served in together. We'll get to that one, but with my first war. So I'm a child of the Cold War. Graduated from West Point in 1988, and was enormously fortunate that. So some people responsible for stewarding and using the funds of a dead, not very nice British man decided that rather than inflict me on the Army immediately, that I needed some finishing school, and so I was sent to Oxford to do that, and was studying international relations at Oxford in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Ironically, given the subject of most of this talk, as a result of a counterinsurgency campaign it was conducting in a country called Afghanistan. And so the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War came to an end, and you may recall, peace broke out all over. And so my prospects, I thought, for an exciting life as a tank commander when I left Oxford were going to be slim. But Saddam Hussein thought otherwise. And Hussein, just as I was graduating from Oxford in the summer of 1990, decided that Iraq wasn't big enough, that it needed a 19th province, and he acquired that 19th province by force of arms. If he'd realized that I'd been assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division and would punish him for that decision, he would have made a different choice, obviously. But so I left Oxford in the summer of 1990, and almost immediately, from the sublime to the ridiculous, was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division and served in my first war, a remarkable little war, Operation Desert Storm. My friends and I took the Iraqi army from the 4th largest in the world to the 2nd largest in Iraq in a period, wait for it, in a period of right at 100 hours. And the American army was delighted. Desert Storm was the war it had wanted to fight ever since World War II. Signs went up on the Pentagon that said, "We only do deserts." And President George H.W. Bush, in my eyes, the best president of my lifetime, said, "By God, we've licked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." Bush, a very good president, a very good man, not right about that particular point, not right at all. Because the American army, which had just so decisively defeated the Iraqi army in a conventional battle that it had wanted to fight for 50 years, right, didn't recognize the fact that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the very rapid defeat of the Iraqi army in conventional force-on-force combat, that there wasn't anybody left who would choose to fight us frontally. Forces that choose to fight the United States in conventional force-on-force combat will lose, and will lose quickly in a matter of days or weeks. Right? And as I reflected on my experience of Desert Storm, the experience of watching the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rapid demise of the Iraqi army, when the American army decided to send me back to Oxford to get my PhD, because we all make sacrifices for national security, I decided to look not at the kind of war I just fought of tank on tank, because I thought that was yesterday's news. Instead, I thought the kind of war we were likely to fight, the kind of war that presented more interesting questions, was the war from the day before yesterday, was a war like the war in Vietnam, a war of insurgency and terror. And so that was the kind of war I decided to study at Oxford University in the summer of 1995. And if you're studying counterinsurgency at Oxford, you have to read the works of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who was an insurgent leader during the First World War. He led a band of Arab guerrillas against a conventional, in his case, Turkish conventional army during the First World War. And Lawrence actually felt sorry for them. He said, for them, we're like a vapor. We rise up out of the sand, we congeal, we strike, and we dissolve back into the sand. They're a blind boxer. No comments about Saturday night. Right. They could kill us if they could only find us and not clinch up. Sorry, that was editorial. A dying sport that needs to die. They could kill us if they could only find us. For them, Lawrence wrote, war on rebellion was messy and slow, like eating soup with a knife. Right. And I happened to read that phrase in the bathtub in Oxford. I'd been for a run on Oxford's Port Meadow, was reading Seven Pillars of Wisdom in the tub, eating strawberries, drinking champagne. It's Oxford, that's what you do here. A little like SMU, honestly. Pretty high-end stuff, right? And I literally came out of the tub and said, Eureka, I've found it. I have the title of my dissertation. 7 words down. 99,993 to go. And to fill out those 99,993 words, I decided to look at 2 previous cases of counterinsurgency campaigns where military forces were unprepared and unable to come to terms with an enemy who wouldn't meet them conventionally. And so I looked at the British counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya, what we would today call Malaysia, from 1948 to 1960. And the Brits started badly. Right? They were not designed, trained, or equipped to fight an enemy who wouldn't meet them frontally. They were designed, 1948, coming right out of World War II, designed to fight another army in conventional combat. But the Brits adapted, they learned, and they ultimately defeated their insurgent enemy in what is today widely viewed to be the classic case of successful Western counterinsurgency in the 20th century. And it only took them 12 years. So when Lawrence said messy and slow, he wasn't kidding. And I compared that case with the American Army in Vietnam, which also started badly when fighting an insurgency, as we would expect, which also adapted and learned, as we would hope, right? And we have Vietnam vets in the room, right? Who can right? Tell me how I'm doing, man. It's not enough that I've got my family and my right, West Point buddies and war buddies with me, but I've got Vietnam buddies with me too. But right, smart, handsome gentlemen here, veterans of the Vietnam War, right? Smart guys. They figured it out, but they didn't figure it out with respect, gentlemen, fast enough. When a great power loses a small war, it does so for only one reason. It's not going to run out of tanks or soldiers or airplanes. It's going to lose because it runs out of national will. And that, I believe, is what happened in Vietnam with enormously bad consequences for the people of South Vietnam, who suffered horribly, the boat people, are a direct result of our failure in Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge came to power in Cambodia, the killing fields, another result of our failure in Vietnam, and finally, enormous damage to our army, to the American army, which took a generation to recover from Vietnam, if it has. And so I argued in my doctoral dissertation in 1997, an army that is able to learn and adapt, and in particular, that is able to learn and adapt to this kind of war, to counterinsurgency campaigns and counterterrorism, is a great advantage for a state in the international system, and it is something to be encouraged and applauded. And I am proud to tell this distinguished audience that finished in 1997 at Oxford University, that doctoral dissertation was the very best doctoral dissertation written, somebody sees it coming, on counterinsurgency in the 1990s. And I am ashamed to tell you that it was the very worst doctoral dissertation written on counterinsurgency in the 1990s, because it was, of course, the only doctoral dissertation written on counterinsurgency in the 1990s. And when I sent it to fine university presses, I won't embarrass them by mentioning their names. Excuse me. Sorry, excuse me. I got letters back from those distinguished university presses, which I won't mention, telling me, John, you write really rather well. You're clearly a smart guy. Why don't you devote your intellectual energies to something that has some contemporary relevance? And so I couldn't get the damn thing published, the best doctoral dissertation written on counterinsurgency in the 1990s. I couldn't get it published until after the attacks of September 11th indicated that perhaps future wars were not going to look so much like Desert Storm, but more like the wars these gentlemen experienced, wars in the shadows. Wars against enemies we had a hard time finding. And having written a book and finally gotten it published, I then went and did the research. So after the attacks of September 11th, the necessary, if poorly conducted, assault on Afghanistan, on the Taliban, attempted to destroy al-Qaeda that had conducted those attacks, and then the completely unnecessary and enormously poorly conducted invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. I got to experience counterinsurgency for the first time with then young John McLaughlin and a bunch of band of brothers in Al Anbar province of Iraq in 2003 and 2004. An enormously difficult fight. Our army was not prepared for this kind of war. We were responsible for a sector of Al Anbar province of Iraq between the towns of Ramadi, the provincial capital of Iraq, fighting going on right there now against ISIS, against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and the town of Fallujah, famous for being very welcoming to visitors. Our town was Chaldea, a tough little town. We fought We fought very, very hard for a year. We lost 22. We had more than 150 wounded. We earned the Valorous Unit Award. And at the end of our year, we were no closer to winning than we had been when we started. And let me, with John in the room, let me pay tribute to his courage, although you didn't really have any choice. Ben Miller didn't give him an option. But John McLaughlin was Apache 6 Lima, the loader on Ben Miller's tank. Ben was Apache 6, one of the bravest men I've ever known. And to fight this counterinsurgency campaign, one of the things we would do was set ambushes for insurgents and then try to provide bait for them to shoot at. And John McLaughlin was the bait. And so Ben Miller would take his tank and drive up and down the streets of Chaldea, Iraq, right at dusk, which was the witching hour, and try to get insurgents to shoot at him in order that his guys waiting in ambush could then shoot the insurgents, right? So in conventional war, the hard part isn't finding your enemy. He's in the tanks that don't look like yours, wearing uniforms that don't look like yours. Right, the hard part is killing him. It's hard to kill those guys. In irregular war and counterinsurgency, right, it's pretty easy to kill the guys. They're dressed not exactly like this. They don't wear seersucker, but they're wearing street clothes for their local community. They are to use Mao's phrase, fish swimming among the sea of the people, but they're hard to find. They hide among the population. And so we struggle for intelligence to figure out who they are, and one of the best ways for them to provide intelligence on who they are is when they fire a weapon at us, we can shoot back at them. And so Ben Miller would run Apache 6, his tank, up and down the streets of Chaldea, daring our insurgent enemies to shoot at him, and they would, and he would shoot back, and his friends would shoot back. And literally throughout Al-Anbar, people tuned in to our net to hear Ben Miller, caustic, funny son of a gun, talk through the fights that ensued literally every night for 8 months, 9 months, 10 months. Although Ben's tank got hit a number of times, neither Ben nor John. John, you were hurt? Yeah, in one of those episodes. Yeah, caught some shrapnel. Yeah, no grave damage. He always looked pretty much like this. Actually, he was a smaller target back then, right? So as I was, and boy, as Ben was, Ben got fat along the way. Enormously difficult fight when we got back. And John didn't get one of these, I don't think, but the battalion made up coffee mugs that said Iraq 2003, 2004. We were winning when I left. Vietnam guys get the joke. We weren't, and we knew it. And I was sent from Anbar almost immediately to the E-Ring of the Pentagon to work for Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. And the Pentagon was a big change from Anbar. Wait for it. At least in Iraq, I had some idea who I was fighting against. Right? And you really, really hope when you're out on point for the nation, whether it's in business or in a school or in a war, as a diplomat, as an intelligence officer, you really, really hope that even though things don't seem to make sense where you are, that back home at headquarters, corporate headquarters, somebody knows what's going on. And it is enormously dispiriting to come back to corporate headquarters and to find out that they don't have a plan and they don't, in fact, have any real connection to what's going on. Right? And another book on this subject by a man named Fred Kaplan, a book called The Insurgents, David Petraeus and the Plot to Change the American Way of War. Fred describes me at this point in my career wandering the halls of the Pentagon with a gaunt and hungry look on my face, desperately seeking someone to talk to about counterinsurgency. Because insurgency was a word we were not allowed to use to describe the fight we were then fighting in Al-Anbar. Don Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, forbid the term from being used. And I will tell you conclusively that just as an alcoholic will never be cured until he admits that he is an alcoholic, an insurgency will never be defeated until you admit that you are fighting an insurgency and need to practice counterinsurgency to do that. And so I wandered the halls of the Pentagon with a gaunt look on my face, remembering the guys we'd lost. And salvation is too strong, but hope appeared in the guise of one of my former West Point professors, a man named David Petraeus, who returned from his second tour in Iraq in the fall of 2005, when I'd been in the Pentagon for a year. And Petraeus and I had kept in touch. We'd both been teachers at West Point's Department of Social Sciences. And I told Petraeus, who had been assigned to take command of the Army's Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, responsible for the Army's thinking about wars, that he needed to write a new counterinsurgency field manual for the Army, a book that had not been updated since 1975. Right? And Petraeus thought that was a really good idea and said he knew just the guy to get to work on that, and told me to get busy. And he was a 3-star, and I was a lieutenant colonel. We've got a lieutenant colonel in the room, and as she will, I'm confident, will attest, when a lieutenant general tells you to do something, you do it. And so I got to work, and with a team of veterans of mostly Iraq, some Afghanistan, some students of counterinsurgency, some PhDs from West Point, and a remarkable man named Frank Hoffman from the Marine Corps. We turned in 13 months the Army's first counterinsurgency manual in 30 years. Right? And so I'm confident when I tell you it was the best counterinsurgency manual we'd had in 30 years. And we published it on December 15th, 2006. Downloaded 1.5 million times in the month that followed, translated and critiqued on jihadi websites, copies found in Taliban training camps in Pakistan, so we knew our enemies were reading it. We just had to get our guys to do that. Right? The process of accomplishing that very difficult objective included getting it published by the University of Chicago Press, getting it reviewed by the New York Times, a first for that august paper, and perhaps certainly most memorably for me, discussing the counterinsurgency field manual with Jon Stewart on camera on The Daily Show in August of 2007, the funniest discussion Jon Stewart has ever had on camera about an Army field manual. And you think because it's the only one he's ever had. No, he tried another one later. It didn't go nearly so well for that guy. But so we were popularizing a series of ideas to our own internal audience. We were enormously fortunate that as the Iraq War, which was had spiraled downhill to essentially full-scale civil war between the Sunni and the Shia by this point, that President George W. Bush had after the midterm elections of 2006 demonstrated the American people had lost faith in the direction he was leading the country. Right? The Republicans lost both the House and the Senate. If we had a civilized country with a parliamentary system, the government would have fallen. Right? We're enormously fortunate that did not happen. President Bush made the bravest decisions of his presidency, replacing his Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, with the most talented, hardest working, most dedicated, best man ever to fill that position, a man named Bob Gates. And Bush also replaced his commander in Iraq, George Casey, a good man, with David Petraeus, in many ways a great one. And Petraeus, in an episode that I believe to be unique in the annals of military history, having published his strategy for a war, then went and implemented that strategy in that war. The book, The Counterinsurgency Manual, has essentially two doctrines, two pillars. One of them is because the insurgents are fish swimming in the sea of the people. To defeat an insurgency, you have to protect the population first, the manual argued. And second, because insurgents are rational actors and counterinsurgency is Darwinian, you have to be able to learn and adapt. And Petraeus implemented both of those pillars of his strategy in Iraq, most memorably building 76 joint security stations throughout Baghdad, compartmentalizing and ultimately controlling the insurgency in Iraq's capital city, and perhaps even more importantly, taking advantage of We have an enormous advantage in this war we are fighting in that our enemies are unbelievably brutal to their own people. And we were fighting two enemies in Iraq at this time, the Sunni tribes in a classic insurgency, but also Al-Qaeda in Iraq, an organization that did not exist in Iraq prior to our invasion, but took advantage of the chaos that we created by not having enough troops on the ground, by not having a strategy to pacify the country, to occupy the country after defeating it. And the Sawa, the awakening came when the Sunni tribes of Al-Anbar, who had been fighting against us with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, decided that they preferred us to AQI and started fighting with us against Al-Qaeda. Right, an extraordinary reversal of fortunes, and Petraeus cleverly did not ask permission to stop fighting against the Sunnis and to start fighting with them against Al-Qaeda. And violence dropped by 3/4 over the course of the 18 months he was in command. I'll finish on Iraq and touch briefly on Afghanistan and then go to questions. Having turned around a lost war and brought Iraq to a place where there was a reasonable chance to expect that there was going to be a reasonable amount of democracy in a country that was going to have a foreign policy that, broadly speaking, was not inimical to that of the United States. We fumbled the ball at the 1-yard line by pulling all American troops out of Iraq in December of 2011. President Obama fulfilling a campaign promise, appealing to his base, but acting against the advice of his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, his Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, his Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Leon Panetta, and his at that point Central Command Commander Dave Petraeus. There may have been a better foreign policy team in Washington, but I can't think of it. They all told the president that if he pulled all American troops out of Iraq in December of 2011, that Al-Qaeda would be back in Iraq within 3 years. He did, and they were right. And we are currently fighting Al-Qaeda 3.0, now under new management, the name of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and doing it, quite frankly, half-heartedly, and doing it again in the towns of Chaldea and Ramadi and Fallujah that John McLaughlin and I know so well. Bitterly disappointing. Turning to Afghanistan, Iraq, an unnecessary war and poorly conducted. Afghanistan, a necessary war, poorly conducted, until Barack Obama, who ran on Afghanistan as the good war, Iraq as the bad war, when he took office in 2009, discovered that Afghanistan was on the brink of being lost. Over the course of his first term, President Obama had to surge troops twice to Afghanistan, doubling troops in Afghanistan not once but twice over the course of his first year. Unfortunately, and this I think is symptomatic of a man who is uncomfortable with the use of force in international politics, does not see himself as a wartime president during the second and what should have been decisive commitment of troops to Afghanistan. In a speech delivered at West Point, which Phil and I graduated from an unbelievable 27 years ago this month, the president announced that he was surging additional troops to Afghanistan, but also, unbelievably, announced the date he was withdrawing them from Afghanistan. Telling our enemies to hold on for 18 months, lay low, and that in 18 months they could have the country. Not the smartest move ever, right? And we remain, our current policy, our current national policy remains to withdraw all American troops from Afghanistan by the end of this president's administration, second term. If we do so, there will be Taliban at the gates of Kabul within 3 years into the next president's administration, just as 3 years after pulling all American troops out of Iraq, ISIS was at the gates of Baghdad, right? And so it is enormously frustrating for a student of foreign policy, a student of counterinsurgency, to find very, very recent lessons and very, very apparent lessons being ignored by this administration. And that is one of the reasons why it is so much fun to be running a boys' school outside Washington and no longer to be banging my head against that particular wall of bricks. I will say in this home of the library of George W. Bush that I have enormous confidence in this country, in the political system of this country, and a very strong belief that the next president of the United States will be a stronger foreign policy president than we have yet had this century. I think that that's a very good thing. Dangers remain, and we need to continue to be vigilant against them. Let me close by complimenting our fine Lieutenant Colonel over here on my left, your right, these two fine cadets, John McLaughlin, this generation of young people who have chosen to serve our country. So when Phil and I entered West Point in 1984, there was no real danger that we would be at war anytime soon. Certainly I didn't think there was. And America had been at peace for a decade at that point. There were no storm clouds on the horizon. These young people, and in particular these two cadets here in the room, right, they chose to sign up in a time of war, right, knowing that they would likely be sent to serve in harm's way. And that is a very different decision, Phil, than the one that you and I made. It is one that I think deserves our greatest respect. And so, ladies, thank you for that decision. As representatives, John, did you sign up after September 11th? You're older than that. Right after September 11th, John McLaughlin similarly signed up knowing that he would be going to war. And we pay a lot of tribute to in this country correctly to the greatest generation, the generation who came of age in the Great Depression and who fought in the Second World War and defeated tyranny, fascism on 2 continents, 3 continents, right? And well, we should. But 2/3 of the greatest generation were drafted. We have over the last 14 years fought 2 protracted irregular wars with a force that has been entirely volunteer. And today, ask these ROTC cadets if you get the chance to talk to them after our talk. Kids, and I've been all over, I've been everywhere, Johnny Cash. I've been talking to ROTC detachments all over America. ROTC cadets are elbowing each other in the throat to get a diminishing number of active duty slots because they so very desperately want to serve our country in a time of war. And so for all the mistakes that have been made by Republican and Democratic administrations over the course of these last 15 years, the real strength of our country, I believe, is in this generation of young people, and I ask you to join me in saluting them. I look forward to your questions.
I'd like to take a seat, take a breath, maybe. Sure. Take the prerogative. And ask the first question, then we'll throw it open in just a moment. There are a million things to say about this talk. There's a million issues, and I'm sure that people have a lot of questions. But I was struck by 2 of your comments and your descriptions of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. You said, referring to the president's decision in 2009 to surge into Afghanistan, you said it should have been a decisive surge. Regarding the war in Iraq, you said in 2011 we were on the 1-yard line. We fumbled on the 1 yard. We were almost there. If we were so close to victory in both cases, why did these places fall apart so quickly? If we were so close that a decisive surge in 2009 would have led to some sort of durable peace, why is it that the Taliban has had such an easy time making mischief after that? If we were on the 1-yard line in Iraq, after spending so much time and money and blood, training the Iraqi army up until 2011, why did that army prove to be such a hollow fiction last summer when it broke down in front of the ISIS advance? Were we really that close to victory in these wars, or were we just telling ourselves a feel-good story and ignoring the underlying problems going on in both societies?
Good question.
Great question. Let's take it. So victory in these wars, victory in war for the United States looks like a long-term occupation of the country we have been fighting in order to keep whatever caused us to have to fight them from having to fight them again. And so 75 years after the end of the Second World War, we still have American troops in Germany, Italy, and Japan. 65 years after the Korean War, we still have American troops there. We don't have American troops in Vietnam because we lost that one, although ironically the Vietnamese would love to have a home port carrier in Cam Ranh Bay. The Chinese would go ballistic, right? History is a wonderful thing, right? The ironies are delicious. 20 years after the former Yugoslavia fell apart, we still have American troops there. We still have American troops in the Sinai. I can keep going, right? So the frontiers of empire are marked by the bones of our soldiers. It's a Roman saying. It remains true in the United States. Currently astride the globe as only Britain and Rome have. And I'm a fan of hegemonic stability theory and of the belief that in an anarchical society, as Hedley Bull described the international system, there has to be a hegemon to set and enforce the rules, and currently the United States has that responsibility. And so what victory looks like in a war for the United States is the long-term basing of American troops in that country to serve as a base for power projection, to serve as political leverage on that country, to mitigate, shape, influence its political development, and as a base from which to train and professionalize its military forces. And we've done this successfully in the countries I've named. We were doing it successfully in Iraq. American casualties had been reduced to frankly less than they are at Fort Hood, if an equivalent number of soldiers are at Hood or at Knox driving up and down the Dixie Highway to the bars in Louisville, right? So some heads go up and down. So right, the cost of maintaining those American troops in those countries was minimal. The benefits of maintaining those troops in those countries was remarkable. And in Iraq in particular, the day after the last American soldier left Iraq, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki fired and issued an arrest warrant for his Sunni vice president and began institutionalized oppression of the Sunni majority in his country. He fired the Sunni commanders of his army units that we had trained and replaced them with his Shiite cronies who had no military capability or credibility with their troops, but were loyal to him personally because he feared a coup from his majority Sunni army more than he feared an external attack, a classic problem of dictatorships. And so when there's another mistake as well, the failure to arm, train, and equip the moderate Syrian rebels in the summer of 2012. Again, a decision that President Obama made against the advice of a slightly different but still very good foreign policy team in the summer of 12, when as a result of that failure, ISIS gained strength in Syria and attacked Iraq. The Sunni population of Iraq was welcoming to ISIS because ISIS looked better than their government in Baghdad, right? And the Iraqi forces that were designed to halt the advance of ISIS had their commanders flee, and the units left without command, without coordination. Still, a number of them fought pretty well. And so, having fought now, we are now fighting the third war in Iraq of my lifetime, of which only one, Desert Storm, my first one, was necessary. I will be damned if I see us fight a fourth war in Iraq because we pull American troops out from this one again and allow Iraq to collapse again. So the fact is that when we toppled the government of Saddam Hussein, right, we acquired both a moral obligation, and that's debatable, we can have that discussion, but certainly a geopolitical, right, defense of America obligation to create stability in that country, right? And we failed to do so. And the president, in what I am confident had to be the most galling decision of his presidency, returned American troops to a war that he had declared over not recognizing that the enemy gets a vote and that the war is over when both sides agree it's over. And so we were, and so the same story is true in Afghanistan. So we need to station 20,000 American troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan for generations, right? Just as we have in Germany, Italy, Japan, Korea, and the former Yugoslavia. That's what our army does.
There is a mic coming in. So.
Thank you very much. There's so many mixed reports that we read about what's really happening with ISIS. Are we making progress from a perspective of territory as well as what the commitment is of the Iraqi troops? And what is the real danger of ISIS?
Yeah, we're screwing this one up pretty badly, too. The president, I think, as a result of his cognitive dissonance, he thought he had ended the war in Iraq. He had to send American troops back to Iraq. It has not sent anywhere near enough troops back and has not been willing to commit them to do what needs doing, that is, to accompany Iraqi forces into combat. As a result, we are diddling ISIS rather than defeating ISIS. So it would take probably 20,000 American troops to be sent back to Iraq to defeat ISIS rapidly. We'd embed them inside Iraqi combat units. Those units would be 3 to 5 times more effective. A number of people in the room have worked with those forces and can agree or disagree, but some have to go up and down. And America brings a bunch of important advantages to that fight. And we could push we could push ISIS out of Iraq relatively quickly. Syria is the hard story. So I mentioned the failure to arm, train, and equip the so-called Free Syrian Army in the summer of 12. Those guys are all dead. There are now no good options in Syria. We have ISIS, which burns alive good Muslims, fathers of 5, and we have Assad, who uses barrel bombs against his own people. Those are the only 2 options in Syria, other than a full-scale American occupation, not with 20,000, but with 150,000 American troops for a generation. Right? We missed that window closed. The Free Syrian Army is gone. They're dead. Right? And so there are no good options left. And this president, this administration, I don't believe can admit that it is currently supporting Assad. It is Assad's air force in the struggle against ISIS, again, pretty half-heartedly. I believe that the next administration, if Assad's forces can hold out long enough and ISIS doesn't win, right, then I believe that the next administration will, in fact, come out in support of Assad as the lesser of the evils. The real danger of ISIS, I say this in Texas, and I have no idea where Garland is. It could be a long, long way from here. It's not, okay. So the real danger of ISIS is that it has become it is Al Qaeda 3.0. So we've had Al Qaeda on the ropes twice, and we've let them off the ropes twice. And ISIS has, according to unclassified estimates I've seen in the press, attracted well over 10,000 Western passport holders to fight in Syria and Iraq. Right? Those people are going to be the gift that keeps on giving for generations, right? And I will remind all of you that Osama bin Laden came of age, was radicalized in a fight that we actually funded in a country called Afghanistan. ISIS is currently winning the war on the internets. It is managing to radicalize people who have never been to Iraq or Syria, right, including in Garland, Texas this week. Those problems are not going to go away, and this is why I believe that diddling ISIS, certainly in Iraq, is such a grave error, right, and is one that I think it is a legacy that this president will be sorry he left behind. Similar to, I haven't made this comparison before, I just realized that the one that President Clinton left behind by failing to take seriously Osama bin Laden when he had a chance to kill that guy during Bill Clinton's presidency. We're going to regret this.
John, thank you. I want to go back to...
Mike Lynn.
I'm Lynn Novak, a senior fellow here at the Tower Center, and I've known John for a while. I wanted to go back to your counterinsurgency strategy and talk about the diplomatic and economic development parts of it, and ask, I know that Brian Crocker, who's ambassador in Iraq, when David Petraeus took over, worked with him very closely on the surge, and then he was removed to go to Afghanistan after Ambassador McBurry had, what is his name?
Eikenberry.
Had butted heads with Karzai. So I want to have you comment on the political dimensions of counterinsurgency strategy.
Ryan Crocker is what I believe a diplomat should be. Remarkable man, fantastic man. So the hard part of counterinsurgency is actually not the military part, hard as that is. The hard part is the political part. And one of the criticisms of counterinsurgency is that we always seem to ally ourselves with unstable or weak political partners, which is true. If they were strong partners, there wouldn't be an insurgency in the country, right? So by definition, if a counterinsurgency campaign needs external assistance, it is going to be because the political leadership of that country is struggling. And President Karzai of Afghanistan, certainly very weak. Nuri al-Maliki, chosen because he was weak and turned out to be a strong man, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Ashraf Ghani now in Afghanistan, interestingly, an exception to this rule and a rare example of democracy working. One of the critical mistakes of the George W. Bush administration was its democracy agenda and its promotion of democracy before the conditions were right for democracy. So democratic peace theory suggests that liberal democracies don't fight with each other, and that's true, but the key word there is liberal, not democracies. For a democracy is simply mob rule. Liberal democracy is mob rule with institutions to protect the rights of the minority. Building those institutions takes decades, right? It's mostly courts and a legal system, we moved to democracy too rapidly, in my opinion, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We were enormously fortunate that Maliki turned out to have the backbone that he did. He needed to be checked, and George W. Bush actually did a good job of keeping him in check. Weekly video teleconferences during his administration, and part of the fumbling the ball at the 1 yard line was President Obama downgrading the importance of our relationship with Iraq when Maliki needed to be held in check. And losing the political leverage provided by 20,000 American troops, as well as losing the intimate personal relationship, not a strength of this president, really, really hurt us. So we need to think very hard about using all the instruments of American power, including economic development, aid, but also our military as a political tool to be used against the government we're allying with, not just the people we're fighting out in the field, right? And then we need to grow a whole generation of Ryan Crockers at places like SMU. But let me put in what has been a dark talk, let me put a ray of hope. Ashraf Ghani, right? Columbia educated, know him reasonably well. We are unbelievably fortunate to have Ashraf Ghani as a partner in Afghanistan right now. And in an earlier question, Josh suggested that Afghanistan was in real trouble. Afghanistan is only in real trouble if we pull the American troops out. So Afghanistan, currently 70% of the Afghan people believe their country is moving in the right direction. That's roughly double the percent of Americans who feel our country is moving in the right direction. Right? And by the way, they're right. Afghanistan coming from a much lower base, but the trajectory of Afghanistan over the last 15 years, unbelievable, right? So there were fewer than 1,000 telephones in Afghanistan on September 11th. phone numbers in that country were 3 digits. Today there are 15 million cell phones in a country of 30 million people. It has changed that country. And Afghanistan is going to be fine. Ashraf Ghani pleading with the administration, with the U.S. Congress, with journalists, with anybody who will listen, that the United States not repeat the mistake it made in Iraq and keep a long-term American security presence in Afghanistan. That ball could fall either way.
Okay, one side in the way back, please.
My name is William Captain. I'm the former commander of the U.S. Constitutional Iraqi Special Forces. Actually, I fought in Chaldea right after you had left, and the people you're looking for are either 6 feet under or in the prison next to the troops. My question to you is, if you were to go back to Iraq, what would you do different? And then when you actually end up getting, both of you and I can end up going back to Iraq, what do you recommend we're going to do? Thank you.
The good news there is that I am now so fat and so old that nobody wants me back.
Right, that one's not going to be an issue. Thank you for your service, sir. You were fighting in Chaldea in 2005. Yeah, nice place, right?
It's a beautiful
Right. There are wonderful people there. And parts of this book starts with a poem about some of the fighting we did in Al Anbar, and it does talk to some of the beauty, I hope, of that country, the land of the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So my last job on active duty in the Army was at Fort Riley, Kansas, training the transition teams we embedded inside Iraqi and Afghan security forces, and that's the capability we need, right, is roughly platoon-sized organizations, 30 soldiers, to embed inside every Iraqi battalion and brigade. Those soldiers, which would include, and then some special forces capabilities, some air capabilities. ISIS is not 10 feet tall. ISIS is simply, in a lot of cases, better than the Iraqi military, as it has been gutted by Nouri al-Maliki. New president, new prime minister in Iraq now, Abadi, appears to be trying to undo some of the damage. I think somewhat successfully, but they need a whole lot more help than they're getting from us. I would then station that force long-term in Iraq, continue to embed American troops inside all of the Iraqi formations, maintain special forces units around the major population centers, to pair with Iraqi special forces, to visit our friends at 3 o'clock in the morning, right, as we've both done, and then some other specialized training capabilities, including Air Force and helicopters. So it isn't that we don't know what to do. It isn't that we don't have the capability to do it, although we have not built the advisory capability or capacity that I believe we should have over the course of the last 15 years. I think that's the biggest military failing of this century, bigger political ones. But it's not hard. I mean, it's hard work, but it's not intellectually hard to figure out what to do. We just don't have an administration that's willing to do it.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. ISIS and all the problems in the Middle East are certainly important. Right now we've got the Chinese building bases in the South China Sea. We've got Putin raising all kinds of hell in the Caucasus, not the Caucasus, well, those two, but in the Balkans as well as in the Baltics. We've got so many problems, and we've got such a very small percentage of the American population involved in the military that most of us have no idea that there's a war going on. How on earth are we going to manage all of these things without a draft?
So this allows me to do one of my favorite parts of these talks, which is criticize my audience. So not your question, but the broad audience and the broader American people whom I love. Geopolitically, demography is destiny. Russia is dying. Life expectancy for Russian males is 55 and falling. Proximate cause of death is alcoholism. I'm genuinely unconcerned with the problems that Russia is making. I think that NATO and the EU overreached into the Ukraine. Ukraine is always going to be more important to Russia than it is to the West, and so I think that was I think that pendulum swung over far. China has made a very big bet. China bet that it was going to grow rich before it grew old. Right? It lost. That is still playing out. But China is. That's one of the two bets China made. The other bet China made was that it could do glasnost without perestroika, that it could open up economically but maintain political control, absolute political control, by buying off the population. So double-digit economic growth rates meant that the people would not stand up and revolt against the authoritarian regime. In fact, it hasn't worked out. The growth rates are falling, 7%, 6%. China has not been able to make the transition to the full information age economy. It is still a high industrial age economy, and so these devices which we all carry, right? Each of them says on it, designed in California, made in China. And the real power is in the design and in the education systems. I stayed here at BYU, 57th best school in America, I'm told, from the last set of rankings, right? The American combination of education system, political system, economic system gives us enormous power. And so we should be paying attention to China, we should be paying attention to Russia, but we are currently contributing, investing roughly half of the percent of GDP that we invested in national security during the Cold War. So it would not break us, right, to throw another 1% of GDP at the national security of this nation and the West, the free world, at this time of uncertainty. This is the criticism I have of George W. Bush and of America. I mentioned earlier the all-volunteer force. It's remarkable performance in 2 wars, and I lost my lieutenant colonel, and she may be too young to. No, she can't be. She can't be, right? I believe that my colonel would agree with me when I said the all-volunteer military is stronger today than it was on September 11th, after 15 years of war. No one that I know of in uniform would want to go back to the war that these gentlemen fought when they had people to their left and right who didn't want to be there. And one of the great advantages we've had in this war, one of the reasons we were able to learn and adapt more rapidly in Iraq than we were in Vietnam, is that everybody wanted to be there, and that we had long-serving volunteers who went back again and again. That said, so I am not upset that this is the first war in American history since the Revolutionary War fought without a draft. I am upset that this is the first war in American history, full stop, fought without a tax increase. We have put the entire $4 trillion cost of these wars, the entire debt the United States has accumulated over its history is $19 trillion. $4 trillion of that debt is as a result of these wars. Right? It has all been on our credit cards, right? And these fine young cadets, right, who are volunteering to go in harm's way for us, they're going to end up paying the bills for our war. And I got to tell you, I think that's super wrong, because they're going to have their own wars to pay for as well. And so George W. Bush's decision not to impose a tax increase after September 11th, I believe, may have been the single biggest failing of his presidency. I think I may have given the hook, but I'll...
Well, I think we have time for one more question, so let's go to the last question.
as a preface to this question, I'm a band of brothers with you, first teamer. Okay.
Live the legend.
Absolutely.
Massage the myth.
Bottom line is, my whole life, starting with my military career, I'm a retired colonel just like you are, has been involved in Thailand, Vietnam, and other places. We won't talk about it in service, both in and out of uniform. We have had Stanley McChrystal here, and we talked about David Petraeus. He's been understood, okay? And of course, we know what happened to those who understood. My problem is, and I hope you have some of the insider information on this question, is that we have all the Bobby heads sitting there in the Pentagon and other places. Where are our war fighters, and are we doing what you and your team has done with the real issues of counterinsurgency, which are our wars of
So great chance to pay tribute to Petraeus and McChrystal, both great men, American heroes in my eyes. Both made critical errors, silly errors, human errors, and that's the bad news, right? And we've lost, to a certain extent, the services of both. I'm pleased to note that even though Petraeus has pled guilty to a felony, that the Obama administration continues to rely on his talents and use him for advice. And I hope we have not seen the end of him in public life. The good news, the really good news, is that although they are the best known, there are many, many others. We have at this point the most experienced military this nation has ever seen. We are, I've gotten in trouble for saying this, but I'll say it again, we are an industrial scale killing machine, counterterrorism killing machine. The problem is not with the American military. The problem is all, in my eyes, with our politicians, and again, ending hopefully. I am hopeful that we are going to get a better foreign policy and national security president than we have yet seen this century, and that will be true, I think, regardless of whether that nominee is named Bush or Clinton.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but before you applaud, I'd like to turn it over to Jim for one.
Thank you very much. My small comment. Our members know well what this is. Someday I'll surprise you. Well, last week I gave somebody a cycling cap. But, John, it is my pleasure on behalf of all of us here to present you with the official World Affairs Council tie, and tonight the Tower Center tie. I think Senator Tower would look good in this.